Welcome to Strategy Execution Unlocked and the 9th episode in our OGs of Strategy Execution series. In this series, I sit down with the true pioneers who've shaped the strategy execution space, industry analysts, authors, founders of management consultancies and software companies, and of course, the seasoned industry practitioners. Today, I'm excited to welcome Mark Soester to the show. Mark is based in Australia and is a PPM and work management subject matter expert. He has helped numerous organizations across a variety of verticals establish project, program, and portfolio management governance processes and associated tooling to improve strategy execution and maximize business value. He is currently the product vision lead and co-founder at Altus, where he drives innovative project portfolio management solutions built on the Microsoft Power Platform, helping organizations to evolve PMOs from delivery focused to strategic value creators. Mark, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having me, Ben. It's lovely to be here. It's good to see you.
Well, is it? No, yeah, absolutely. So when I think about strategy execution, it's a pretty broad space, right? So depending on what role you're playing in, it can mean different things to different people. Why don't we start there? What does strategy execution mean to you?
Well, strategy execution as such really starts with strategic planning. I think the challenge of strategy execution is breaching the gap and the chasm between strategic planning and strategic execution. And for me, the execution of the strategy is like an organizational GPS system, from an area to where we are now to where we ultimately want to go to, and the most effective path to reach that. For me, that is the strategic execution. Now, within that area, organizations always have organizational specific constraints, and these constraints, no matter in what organization you work, always seem to be the same. They seem to be of financial nature, of resource nature, of time, and of risk nature. Incorporating those into a recipe of finding the most effective way to reach your strategy, for me, that is strategic execution.
Oh, I like that, the GPS system. That's a good way of looking at it. What do you think some of the bigger challenges organizations face from integrating strategic planning with execution? I've had a few guests on before that talked about the struggle really to identify, the right initiatives in the first place based on the clear definition and communication of strategy. What jumps out to you?
Well, I think what you already outlined, one of the most biggest challenges that I see is really the translation, the strategic goals into language that every staff member understands. I like to call it the operalization of strategy, making sure that we operize the strategy and doing this by ensuring that work is evaluated against the strategy. Now, very often that communication platform between strategy and executives versus the operational staff, that is often a blind spot. So therefore, organizations often don't know why they do the work and how to measure that work. In my view, that is one of the biggest challenges that organizations face, really bringing this into a measurable component so that you can determine the GPS. You wouldn't be able to drive your Tesla from A to B if you don't know the road, if you don't know the path to get there. And I think that communication is very often one of the biggest challenges that executives face. How do you convey that message?
Do you think that the executives today understand the implications of having suboptimal strategy execution capabilities and the impact that has in terms of the overall business performance?
I think I truly believe that this is number one issue of every executive, actually. Planning strategy is actually, I call it the fun bit, right? That's actually the visionary part where you have to look beyond the horizons, beyond the second and third horizon to see where you want to end up. Realizing that plan is the hard part. And, as my mother always used to say, a dream without a plan. What did she say? An idea without a plan is a dream. And I think when you translate that into strategy, you would say, the the definition of a clear strategy is the prerequisite for you to determine the plan so that this idea of the strategy can actually be executed. So that translation, I think, is what the challenge for most executives is. If you run a business, I envisage the first thing that I would want to see is waking up in the morning and see that my strategy, that the work that I have conducted has moved the strategic needle, trying to navigate through the cliffs of our day-to-day work. And I think that challenge is what keeps executives awake at night, actually. Yeah.
So how do you think they're addressing that challenge then, right? Because it feels to me that still when I look across many organizations, the first part of addressing that is the clear communication and articulation of strategy across the organization. I think most organizations aren't doing that well.
Yes.
And then obviously the bookend to that first challenge is, as you said, the measuring the outcomes, right? And it feels that if the C-suite did care and understood the implications that suboptimal strategy execution capabilities is impacting business performance, and they're losing value, they're deferring value due to this, you think they would take responsibility for those two things, setting the North Star to ensure that strategy was clearly understood, and then putting measurable targets so that they could adjust the course as needed.
Yeah. To be fair, this is a tough job, right? Trying to get an overview of your organization on a day-to-day basis and then trying to map that with your strategy, or navigating the organization towards that towards that strategy is a tough job, no doubt. I think executives very often delegate that, right? So they set up that initial goal, and these goals may even be measurable as such, but then translating that into the evaluation of the work that you need to conduct, that middle step is very often delegated to senior management. I call it, I don't know, the Chinese whisper. I'm not sure whether that's appropriate to say these days, but it really is that Chinese whisper. I see that even when we go to organizations and we want to have exposure to executives, it's actually quite difficult at times, because they don't want to bother the executive. So I think the challenge really is communication and collaboration and continuous coaching of what you mean with your strategy, and also updating your senior managers on the direction, on the moving needle. These are the components that I see are very challenging in the executive space. As we both know, there is not a one-size-fits-all approach. Every organization is unique in their own way, but ultimately I really believe it has lots to do with communication and collaboration, continuously clarifying the direction that I want to go to as an organization. Again, I love analogies. I always see this as, as an executive, you are the captain at the helm, and you are guided by the dials that you see on your helm, right? We refer to those as visualization dashboards, let's say. Well, how do you ensure that, because you are not necessarily the subject matter expert of the engineering room, that's why you have an engineering manager, how do you ensure that communication is always upheld? I think that's one of the biggest challenges. Organizations have that by, fragmented work and fragmented data that doesn't come together. Often inconsistent processes in terms of governments and governance itself. And really the articulation of the terminology to the operational terminology. If organizations find that link and find that communication capability, they are a step closer breaching that chasm between planning and execution.
That makes a lot of sense. So when it sounds like then you need that function that's going to help bridge that gap and provide a conduit from the executives through the organization. Obviously, you're very familiar with working with PMOs that ultimately, at least for the discretionary activity and spend, the projects, the initiatives have been looking to bridge that gap or trying to bridge that gap for years. You talk about, when I introduced you, we talked about that sort of delivery focused PMO versus a value driven PMO. What's the role in your mind of that PMO, or potentially, whatever that office needs to be able to help the executives with that communication layer, and in essence, figuring out the plumbing within the organization, right, to get maximum value throughput?
Yeah, no, I hear what you're saying. Look, we both, and obviously this podcast as well comes from that PMO area, and unfortunately, PMOs have evolved over times to become what I call the toothless tiger. Very often, lots of responsibility, very little power. And I have worked in institutions that have created or resolved the PMO based on executive coming and going. Now, if you translate this into the business world, could you imagine that when a new CEO starts in a company that they say, hey, you know what? Finance is just an administrative overhead. Let's kick that. Unimaginable, really, if you think about it. Well, in a PMO, what you actually do is you predict, you can change your destiny with a PMO. And I think that recognition is not there. The current status quo of PMOs is very often a governance function. But the ultimate purpose, in my view, what a PMO should be doing is it should be able to predict the future. It should be able to predict this GPS navigation to mitigate the risk of organizational failure. In order for a PMO to achieve that, or I'm going to call it a body in an organization. I don't even want to put the PMO narrative on this, because that narrative, unfortunately, has become quite a burden narrative, right? When you talk about the PMO, people go, oh, that's boring. Actually, a PMO has the ability for you to really predict the outcome, the navigation of the organization to execute your strategy. And in my view, that elevation of that role needs to be in every organization. Now, some organizations have done that through the introduction of what they call a strategic PMO, so really the ability for you to predict that. Again, it is very segregated, unfortunately still. And that combined view of executing strategy through the operational work, that combined, I think, is an absolute necessity. Delegation from an executive level, but a delegation to a body that has the ability to evaluate the work very clearly, again, against those strategic goals. It's again that navigation of that GPS system. I need to be very clear as the Tesla, I need to be very clear where I need to go. And I need to be very clear about the constraints that I have. I can't just drive over this field because there is no road, right? Organizations work very similar. So you need to make sure that you give that right power, and again, communication and collaboration, constant communication and collaboration to them. Just like the captain will always talk to their head engineer to see that the engine is still running of that ship, so that we can navigate through the cliffs of. So again, in my view, it comes down to that communication part. Technology helps us these days and will help us more and more. And especially in the world today, I mean, we are going through a revolution in terms of what digital capabilities you have through AI. And I wonder whether PMOs will finally be freed from those governance of process, where agents have the ability to automatically do that and actually have then the freedom and the doctrine of trying to predict those outcomes, because a PMO needs to be able to predict an outcome. Right now, when you have a profit and loss statement in the finance team, well, there's nothing you can do about it, because these are just factual information. If you look at a PMO report or a portfolio report, well, what you ultimately want to be able to do is to predict the direction and also understand the constraints and navigate through those constraints. So you still can do something about it, because you are talking about the future. That emphasis, I think, is not in executive management's mind. They don't see these bodies as the ability for you to mitigate your risk by predicting the outcome. They think the body ensures that the work that we conduct is conducted on a consistent basis. And I think that perception from the executive management can change. And at the same time, these bodies, these PMO bodies, need to be able to continuously understand the direction. And if they don't understand that, they need to be able to ask. They need to be able to communicate. They need to be able to collaborate with those executive management teams. And I think the larger the organization becomes, the more difficult it becomes as well. Again, moving that analogy from, a little speedboat, if I want to turn left, I turn left. Try to turn left in an ocean liner, right? You turn left and half an hour later it starts to turn left. And I think that is actually the challenge of that strategic execution as you grow.
No, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, I think to a degree, the delivery focused or the tactical focused PMO has painted themselves in a corner, right? Because they've always focused on the tasks, having consistency there for timesheeting and whatever else, right? And not necessarily been thinking as much from a business mindset or a value mindset, right? It's interesting to me that, PMI PMBOK now is saying, look, we're focused on outcomes, changing for PMO to a VMO, a value management organization. I mean, you've got to be careful, right? Because you can't just move the PMO to a value management focus or to an enterprise function, call it whatever you want, strategy execution office, transformation office, if they're still going to bring that tactical mindset, that in terms of focusing on project execution, right? Versus actually really looking at the value side of the equation. And both are important at the end of the day, right? We still need good execution, right? You mentioned as well, probably because the PMO has been seen as overly bureaucratic because they've put rigid governance structures in place, and they're now AI agents. Maybe they could govern while the PMO does other things. To a degree, I feel like less governance is needed, right? No, AI driven or human driven, right? So one of the things we're focused here at the Strategy Execution Forum is getting the C-suite to understand that this is a problem, and from your perspective, you think that they see that, and then needing that enterprise function, whatever you want to call it, value management office, enterprise PMO, probably not call it that, strategy, whatever you want to call it, to be able to then deal with the changes needed, develop the strategy execution muscle across the entire organization, right? Now, what's interesting to me as well, the PMO often is synonymous with projects, obviously, initiatives, or the discretionary spend, right?
Yes.
But obviously, the operational activity and spend in an organization is significantly bigger than the budget you have to drive innovation or growth. So that's the other part of this, and wanted to get your thoughts on this is the PMO or whatever that new enterprise function is going to be. Maybe the PMO people are the right people to lead that function, but they have to understand that they've got to play well in the sandpit with the other key functions in the organization, right? That are also approaching, have a role to play in strategy execution. You mentioned strategic planning. You mentioned finance, right? When you think about the operating fabric of the business, the people in the engine room or operations, right? Business architecture, right? All the way through to, the people doing the work, that governance model or operating model needs to, bring these folks together so you have a cohesive thing. So it's what's your thoughts there in terms of the other roles that need to play a part in solving this problem?
Look, I always, when I think about those things, I always think about the past, right? So the purpose of the PMO, I think, originally was to ensure that projects that I approve are not falling aside of the rail, that they actually execute in a predictable manner. And as I said, that really should be the main role. And you're spot on that one of the main challenges that the PMO as the toothless tiger faces is that very often they have a discretionary budget, which is only a puzzle piece of the entire picture. The recognition that projects at the end of the day, Ben, there's only work. Operations is only work. It really is. It's always the same. When you boil it down, it's always work. My team needs to conduct some work to achieve something, to keep the lights on, to achieve some innovation, to make sure that we comply to any kind of legacy legislative changes. All of those things. I think PMOs should also recognize that projects is just work. We just frame it in a particular time frame. There is the opportunity, I think, to combine that operational and that non-operational work into that strategic layer, that body, I'm going to call that has the ability to manage all of that, because they need to manage organizational constraints. So I, as the PMO, need to understand, well, what resource availability do I have to actually execute that? Well, if I don't know the operational side of it, I am a one-eyed predictor, but I need both eyes. So there is most definitely the opportunity to incorporate both of those functions to become constraint managers, managing constraints and predicting what kind of investment in resource, finance, time, risk, what kind of investment is required in order to achieve the outcome. And that's still, at the end of the day, always the same. No matter for what company you work has one purpose only: to predict and execute strategy. When I look back into the past, that was never a mindset of the PMO. It was the process definition, making sure that I have the ability to provide you visibility you can trust. And that is process definition. That change I can feel very clearly in our industry now, which also tells me that this industry is actually maturing, looking back from where we were 20 years ago to where we were now. We used to implement that, hey, you need one process, let's say Prince2 or PMBOK or whatever process is out on the markets. These days, organizations face the challenge that it's not one way that rules them all. There are 50,000 different ways. Combining them, and if you boil it down, is still only ever work. So if you have that work mindset and managing that work against the organizational constraints to predict the outcome, I think that is the recipe for you to provide that clarity and direction. And again, looking at back from a financial perspective, I think finance has actually shown us that way. I come from Germany. I can talk to an American accountant and we have an instant rapport. I can talk to a Chinese accountant and we instantly know what we are talking about. When you go into an organization these days and you talk to 5 different project managers, for example, you will get 5 different answers. That is still the issue. And that's where the maturity can increase over time to ensure that we always have the same terminology, that we always talk about work in terms of work, no matter whether it's project work or operational work.
I think you're right. I mean, when I first established the strategy execution forum, I was looking for definitions of what strategy execution is, right? And there's many definitions out there, and many, it's like you said, to just get a clear line of sight between the strategy and what goes on in the organization. But I think you have to broaden it it is really the optimization and the strategic alignment of all activity and spend, right? With
exactly.
Strategy, right? Because, like I say, you've got the operational budget, then you've got the discretionary spend, right, where the PMOs spend most of their time. So when I think, what we're trying to achieve here, and I think, you're trying to achieve, everyone's trying to achieve, is get the C-suite buy into there's a problem, establishing that enterprise function that's going to be able to forensically look, at how all that work and activity and spend aligns with the strategy. And to do that, it truly takes a village, right? Because there isn't, you and I have been doing this for longer than we both care to remember. Mm-hmm. But now, we're not experts in all the domains, right? We'll be stronger in finance. So do we know a lot about business architecture, enterprise architecture to ensure that operating fabric is right-sized or is going in the right direction relative to your strategy? So it is a huge problem, right? And one that requires multiple roles to come together to figure out a cohesive operating model personalized to that particular organization, because what's right for organization 1 is not necessarily going to fit organization 2, right? To be able to pick through this, I say develop that strategy execution muscle. And that's why, to me, the backing of the C-suite is so important, right? And the establishment of that enterprise function, whatever you call it, because that's a multi-year journey to go and figure that out, right?
Definitely.
But we did some initial research on trying to quantify the business value at risk due to suboptimal strategy execution capabilities. And I'm sure there are things we missed here, but no, we distilled it down into two key areas of risk. We're called structural portfolio risk, which is, you mentioned, the strategic planning. It's not just about the PPM side of strategic planning, though. You just look at suboptimal strategic portfolio management capabilities, but also business and enterprise architecture capabilities. And some of the leading indicator metrics for business value erosion there were just natural misalignment of the project portfolio or the initiative portfolios with the strategy. And I think if I recall, it was low performing organizations were at risk of not even identifying the right work, right? You've got the wrong portfolio in the first place. It could be leaving up to 24% of value on the table from the get-go. Insidious risk. You don't even know you're missing it, but it's not even there in the first place. And then you look at things like, redundancy across the portfolio, especially when you've got a larger organization, you don't have an enterprise functions looking across. There could be another, 5 to 10, whatever it was, like 5%, I think it was, that could be lost through to redundant initiatives, right? So about 30% and change of value not being identified in the first place before you even start executing, right, is a problem, right?
Without knowing, without recognizing and knowing it.
Yeah, without knowing. And normally because you've got bottom-up kind of annual planning processes versus top-down planning process, which starts with the decomposition of strategy clearly across the organization, right, which is, to me, still a major problem. Then we looked at things like, operational bucket, right? The operational bucket is far bigger, in terms of size of budget than discretionary. So, most organizations don't have strong and integrated business and enterprise architecture capabilities, right? So, how much operational savings could be made from rationalizing, operating fabric of your business, right? Because you've got, again, duplication in the IT side, which is, again, a rounding error, but you go into business, redundant capabilities or overlapping capabilities, processes, whatever it may be. And we found that on lower performing organizations could rationalize around 9% of the overall operational savings, right? Which is significant. Now, you could bank that, but that's not the point. But if you actually then redirect that funding to innovation, it was actually increasing the average discretionary budget by 40%. So you could save money, and then move it across, rob Peter to pay Paul to increase innovation spend or growth spend by 40%, right? So in that alone, right, you've got 30% of value not being identified, and potentially 40% uplift on your discretionary spend. Now, of course, that's going to take a while to do that, right? You're not going to rip that out in 1 year or whatever, right? But that's significant. Now, and then the second part of the risk, or the second category of risk, was more understood, the portfolio execution risk, right? When you've got outright failures, whatever the standards group say and others, right? Through to challenge rates, in terms of projects going late or over budget, right? And that again was leading to another, I think it was like 80% or so, or 16% or so of value being lost for low performing organizations on outright failures. Another, again, I forget the exact numbers, but a fairly significant percentage, I think it took up to like 24% through cost overruns, right? Because cost overruns, budget is finite, right? So if you overspend, right, you've got to take money away from someone else, right? So you're losing value, right? And then, of course, the thing we all know in terms of delays, well, we're actually deferring value, right? So it's different. It was literally 30% being unrecognized from bad planning capabilities, another 30% being lost through poor execution capabilities, another 24% or so being deferred. You're going to get the value, it's just going to come later. Right? So to me, that's low performing organizations. Obviously, that you've got high performing organizations, you've got a bunch of organizations in the middle. But to me, the numbers are stark, right? And it really warrants that forensic analysis in the organization, driven by this new function with the backing of the C-suite, to try and fix that, develop that muscle, or whatever analogy you want to use. Fix the plumbing so you're getting greater value throughput, right? And not leaking a bunch.
I had a very interesting conversation with a professor from a university that does MBAs. And I think it's fair to say that, many executive managers have that business acumen through their education. Let's just call it an MBA for another term. And we had exactly the conversation that you've just outlined. So executives are trained very well towards, well, finances, for example, because they know it's of critical importance. If you look at the education, I think there is still a very big component that is under evaluated, and that is really that body, that execution body. I think if the education includes that as a main pillar of an organization, so that you can, and let's call it the predict the future pillar for another term, whether that's operational or whether it really is managing constraints. If you have the ability to incorporate that already in the mindset, starting at the educational space, I think that would go a big step towards resolving, or at least reducing, the issue of all the areas that you've just outlined, all the losing waste that we as an organization face. And look, I see this. I run a small organization of 100 people, and I have almost the same challenge, and that I see with organizations that run 10 or 20,000 people. That waste seems to become bigger as your organization grows. If you have the right executive and the right attitude on resolving that issue, they are usually the executives that are super successful, because of the recognition of saying, well, actually, this is just white noise. No, that's actually very, very important for you to execute your strategy. Optimize your constraints. Constraints means optimize your financial return, optimize your resources to be productive. That's what we are hearing right now in terms of AI. AI takes away administration, and therefore you have the ability to become more creative or more collaborative as a human being. We'll see whether that actually, whether that promise will be fulfilled in the future. But I think that is one of the areas that I can see executives can really still receive that kind of education in terms of managing your organizational constraints. It's the GPS, right? It's the battery that you have in your Tesla that tells you, you can go from A to B, but you need to recharge there because your constraints are running out. A business has the same constraints. By the way, these execution parts are also very often driven by finance, because that's number one constraint that we need to worry about. You mentioned CapEx versus OpEx, operational work versus project work. How often do we hear that? So interestingly enough, I think often these execution parts of the strategy are directed because of the financial constraints, and not so much of the outcome that we want to focus on in the first instance. Yeah.
No, absolutely.
Look, I'm sure there is no golden book that will tell any executive in the future how to optimize an organization to close that and to breach that chasm between execution and between planning and execution. But again, looking back to where we were 20 years ago and where we are today, this industry is maturing. And I think it matures, and you, I'm sure, see that too in the market, right? The recognition of the importance of all of the risks that you just outlined are more and more understood on all levels.
No, it definitely is. And I think you and I have been working in a long time, right? And I think now in the mid 2020s is actually, this is where it becomes mainstream versus when we were first working on this in the early 2000s.
Exactly.
But my concern is, and I like your kind of the ship analogy, or at least the engine room, right? To me, you have a bunch of specialists in the different parts of the organization that are doing a great job, right? But they've got to come together to share their knowledge to build that operating model, or that cohesive operating model that's right for the organization, right? Because it is literally moving the whole organization in the right direction. And often I find, those different functions, I wouldn't necessarily they're competing, but they're kind of in conflict to one another, right? The PMO is saying my thing is the most important. Business architecture is most important. Right?
Exactly.
Now, this is most important, versus saying, look, we all have a piece of the puzzle, right? And we have to come together to be able to figure this out for this for this organization. So one of the reasons I founded the Strategy Execution Forum was because I feel like that message needs to be landed. Because even when I look at the real opportunity of AI, or maybe even the distraction currently of AI, right? I'm starting. AI needs. You need to train AI to do certain things. So yes, AI can help with that, identification of value loss and how you're going to maximize value. But you've got to point it in the right direction. You've got to understand what are those leading indicator for business value erosion, like I was just outlining, right? Just hoping it's going to magically figure it out. I'm already seeing some of these functions saying the PMO is ideally placed, right, to deal with AI adoption across the organization. I'm seeing the change management offices or officers saying, no, it's all about culture. So we need, but we're not just talking about, we can get easily distracted of applying AI liberally across an organization versus saying, what I'm focused on here is saying, how do we develop with or without AI? It's going to be with our strategy execution muscle, right, across it, which is going to be about bringing functions together. It's going to be about defining the right processes and then injecting AI and other forms of technology.
Without thinking about technology, Ben, I always like to call it the get off your high horse, because it's actually company politics. And you outlined it. Hey, I'm more important than they are more important. As in countries and in the world, politics, unfortunately or fortunately at times, dictates the direction that we go. Organizations have that too, and the larger the organization is, the more company politics occurs. Going back into that mindset of, I'm going to call it first principles, where you actually form a team, a body that wants to achieve, wants to win, I call it the Champions League, right? Wants to win the Champions League. And in order to do this, you need to understand the direction that you go to. So I think there is definitely an opportunity with technology in mind as well. There's an opportunity to go back to first principles and actually define something that is fully embedded as a pillar to an organization, just like the finance area is a tremendous pillar of an organization going into that direction. And it has to be, because unlike 20 years ago, where you may have had time to adjust into new situations, our world's getting faster and the pace is getting faster and faster and faster. You need to be able to apply those changes quickly, and they need to trickle down all the way from the top to the bottom. And I think there's actually an opportunity in the future to, right now, to introduce this as a general body of a pillar of body that gives us the direction of the organization. Because as you said, these issues are true. They are actual. Every organization has them, no matter whether you have 100 people or whether you have 10,000 people. We know that we made a career out of that, and we still have not found the golden rule of how to apply that. Maybe there is no golden rule, but the opportunity of recognizing and then designing that as a team without the politics can be a path forward to really resolve those chasms.
Well, I think you're right, but I think the first step in solving a problem is to acknowledge you have a problem. Right?
Acknowledge it.
Acknowledge the problem, and then there's going to be smart people that come together to right the ship, right, to keep on the shipping analogies, right? So, yes. I normally end these ones with where do you see this space going? I think we've kind of touched on this to a degree, right? Unless there's any other trends you see that are top of mind.
I can only talk for myself here, right? And what I have experienced over the years and what I am experiencing now, and the way that I also communicate even to my team. I tell them that, what you have done in the past will most likely not be what you are going to do in the future. I truly believe that we are on the cusp of that revolution that allows organization to rethink, I'm going to call it productivity. Because optimizing your constraints, let's translate that into productivity. And I think we are now at that point in time where it may actually be possible to introduce those rules similarly to the rules that we have in finance, where everybody understands those rules and understands what a P&L is, what cost is, what revenue is. that we are now at that cusp where we have the opportunity to bring this into common mind as well, because we need to be able to predict the outcome, and therefore we need to even have the right terminology and the right process. So where do I see the future? I hope that administration doesn't taint our work going forward. I think that's very important. Where mindsets need to shift, even the mindsets of the PMO, that they say we are not just a governance body. We reduce risks by giving you a GPS navigation system so that you know the area. That mindset, I believe, is we are in the process of actually changing that and enhancing that. So I'm super excited about it, because I think as we kind of fell into that profession. As I said, I wasn't a boy that says, I want to be able to resolve a strategic execution. You learn, you just don't do that, right? But having been in that industry for such a long time and being proud of trying to resolve that issue, I can definitely see that we are moving. Technology enables us to open up our mind and go back to first principles, to once and for all trying to resolve that. So we'll see. Maybe we'll have a chat again in 10 years' time, and we'll remember this podcast and look back and say, oh God, what were we talking about? We now need more people.
Well, I'm sure we'll speak before then.
I hope so too.
I hope to have you back. But no, listen, Mark, I really appreciate you taking the time.
Yeah, I love talking to you and love talking about the subject, because, as you said, single organization, no matter whether it's a government, whether it's private, every organization has that issue. They're trying to predict the outcome, by defining the goals and navigating towards that. And let's call it GPS.
No, I will from now on. Well, thanks again for your time, Mark.
Thank you, sir. It's been a pleasure.